Hi guys, it's October 25th. Sorry I'm out today. You got 3 tasks today. You're going to be taking some notes. You're going to complete a reading and marking the text activity, and then you'll have time to work on your journals. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint pretty quickly, but you can pause the video at any time that you need to make sure that you're getting all the notes written down. So you need to take out a sheet of notebook paper. Notebook papers, you can take notes. You can either take the notes from that continue on from last class, or you can pause the video to get out your notebook paper and just take out a sheet of paper and start. Whatever's easier for you. Okay. So the last slide that you probably have in your notes is this slide. We talked a little bit about the impact of the railroads, brought settlers west, gave the creation of towns, encouraged the slaughter buffalo, and then obviously it would increase the amount of confrontations that whites, Europeans had with the Native Americans. So we're going to pick up there with the conflict of the Native Americans, and we're going to talk about the Indian Wars. So I like this quote from Helen Hunt Jackson. She says, "It makes little difference, however, where one opens the record of history of the Indians. Every page and every year has its dark stain. The story of one tribe is the story of all." So I want you to think about this for just a minute. If you need to pause, you can. And I want you to think about, what is she saying? What is her message about the relationship between whites and natives throughout our history? So with those thoughts in your mind, we're going to kind of introduce the Indian Wars. Next class, we'll actually look at some of the different battles. So the Indian Wars, really begin all the way back in 1493 when Columbus first comes to the New World. He landed in what would be Santo Domingo today. So right off the coast of like Panama, kind of in the Haiti, actually it's in the Dominican Republic today. Island of Haiti and Dominican Republic, right just below Cuba, just below Florida, kind of right in the Bahamas area. The relationship between Europeans and natives have always been, one where the natives kind of just were resigned to the whites. They did fight against them, but I don't think white Europeans really pushed into the rest of the continent, especially in America, until much later. So for 200 years, the Indians that were really on the coastline, they did move away and sort of resettled into the center of the country. But the Native Americans who lived in the Midwest, they really weren't impacted a whole lot by expansion into the center of the country. It wouldn't really be until after the Civil War ends that we really see the United States government pushing settlers into the center. Of course, back in 1803, the United States had purchased the Louisiana Territory, which would sort of solidify most of what was the country up until that point. And so with the finalization of that, and then of course with the Civil War, we have sort of all this territory, and we have all these new immigrants in the United States, and the idea was, to thin out some of the larger populated areas in, New York, all really up and down the coast. And so we see more and more people moving to the Midwest for various reasons, all of which we've covered before. It would be late in the 1800s, after the United States has established a policy of removal. It is in place. They want to move the Native Americans out of areas where whites may want to settle. And so instead of, really assimilating or encouraging Native Americans to sort of join into the new kind of American culture, it became one of concentration. So they began to move Indians onto reservations. Some tribes would move peacefully, other tribes would fight for their land, all of which would all eventually end in them being placed into a reservation. So reservations were basically territories that were set aside by the United States that typically was not great to farm, probably difficult to ranch. And so therefore it was undesirable to whites. And so they thought that they could just move the Native Americans to those areas. The problem was then they knew that they were going to have to support many of these different tribes because they didn't have a way to sort of support themselves. There were no jobs. There was nothing for them to grow. They couldn't raise any animals. And so the government became responsible to them or for them. So it seems like a great deal. The federal government's going to create an organization called the Bureau for Indian Affairs. The Bureau for Indian Affairs was responsible for taking care of Native Americans on these reservations. The problem was many of the agents who were responsible for taking the products from the government to the reservations. Sometimes they would steal things. Sometimes they would only give the tribes half their resources, half their stuff, and then sell the other half to whoever and make a profit on it. So it was sort of compounded by the fact that the people who were supposed to be taking care of them were corrupt as well. So this is just a picture, and it shows you the different reservations that were created during this time. Now we'll study all of these different battles. But the purple indicates reservations. And if you know your geography, you know that these areas are not really ideal areas to live. Most of Oklahoma at this point in time was a reservation. But they put all of these different tribes together in these reservation areas. And they weren't very large areas. And so sometimes you would see infighting, sometimes because some of these different tribes were against one another. They already had sort of bad feelings towards one another. So beginning in 1862, the United States government would sort of change its tactics, and it would sort of become more aggressive in its desire to get rid of Native Americans in the United States or condense them to these reservations. They were not opposed to using very inhumane tactics. Essentially, they were practicing genocide. And the goal ultimately was to allow for all of the good white territory to be available for whites. So in the end, all of the tribes were forced onto reservations. They didn't have a choice. What kind of impact does that have? Well, they lost their traditional way of life, their customs, cultures, food, music, all those things, were being threatened to be lost. And so, there's a revival now, but it's still, how many traditions, how many things were lost as a result of whites making room for Native Americans during this time period. The last thing that really impacted the demise or the downfall of the Native American tribes in the United States was the sort of the annihilation of the bison. Bison were hunted for sport, so oftentimes people would just go out and shoot them just to see if they could, because they wanted to have a big game trophy. Some people hunted them for their fur. Often people did not hunt them for their meat. Their meat was not as desirable as beef or chicken or pork. And in the end, they did it to hurt the Native American tribes. They knew that they could force tribes onto reservations with the promise of food if the food source that they had always depended on was disappearing. So there were other tactics that they used to try and encourage Native Americans to assimilate or to become more white. One of them was the Indian schools. Most tribes did not want their children to be sent to Indian schools. They resisted it. They tried to stop it. Um, but in the end, ultimately, it didn't matter. So this is an interesting photograph, I always thought. So this is a photograph of three boys prior to going to the Indian school, and then, of course, while they were in school. And you can see this creates a really sad and, almost as unfortunate um, split, I guess, or, problem for these people because on the left, the photograph shows them in their traditional clothes, their traditional costumes. And so here they look like the tribe, they fit in with the tribe, they know who they are. But when they were taken, and they were taken, it wasn't like something that you signed up for school. These children were taken away from their tribes and they were sent to these Indian schools and they were forced to dress in white clothes and they had to cut their hair. They weren't allowed to speak their own language. They weren't allowed to call themselves by their given names. And so when they did go home, they looked different, and their family and their friends didn't really know what to do with them or how to accept them back when they were finished with school. And so they often did not go back to the tribe. And then as on the same side, as they tried to integrate into American society, they were still ultimately Native American. And so that was another dimension. They suffered lots of discrimination and prejudice because they were Native American. So, yeah, lots of problems came with this. And so this is the article that you guys are going to read next. When you're finished with your article, you, of course, can work on your journal. Again, you can work on notes, you can work on vocabulary. I just ask that you make sure that you have all the notes from this PowerPoint in your notebook. If you need to go back and pause the video at any point in time, you absolutely can. If you have any questions, please write them down and we will go over them first thing on Tuesday. Have a wonderful day.